And I'm going to chair this final session for the first day of our conference. It's an honor for me to do that and to introduce each of the three speakers. And we're going to start with Dr. Donal Coffey. He is a doctoral graduate of UCD. There's a real UCD thing going on today. He has lectured at Portsmouth and at Surrey, but he's currently a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History. And he is going to talk to us about a subject that is very much within his expertise. It's the 1922 Constitution of the Free State and its status as a stepping stone. So I'll pass on to Dr. Coffey. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a bit different from that.
I didn't know that. Fair enough.
I changed it after I talked to you initially. So the new title of the paper is 1916-1921 and the Destruction of the Legal Unity of the British Empire. And what I want to discuss in my talk today is the following question. Did 1916 shape the evolution of the British Empire? Because what you see when you look at histories, and particularly nationalist histories of 1916, they tend to treat the topic as one of kind of a binary relationship, typically the relationship between Ireland and the United Kingdom. And I think this overlooks the more far-reaching changes which 1916 and its progeny wrought in the edifice of the British Empire itself, specifically that part of it which was called at the time the British Commonwealth of Nations. If you want an idea of what I'm talking about, imagine a series of circles getting wider. In the centre you've got the United Kingdom. Beyond that you've got the British Commonwealth of Nations making up the dominions, plus the UK. And then you've got the empire around that, which would include places that are not self-governing, so for example, the West Indies. I don't intend to claim here that the revolution of 1916 was intended to secure dominion status which was achieved under the Irish Free State Constitution. Tom Moore, I think, earlier today has already convincingly demonstrated that that was not really a possibility. But what I want to look at is, first of all, what 1916 was intended to do, or if we can ascribe legal meaning to it, and then look at what happens once this idea starts working itself through the institutions of the state, specifically in relation to the Irish Free State Constitution. And what we see is that once dominion status is achieved, the politicians of the Free State succeed in reshaping the element of the British Empire that's called the British Commonwealth, first through engagement with the institutions of the Commonwealth, and latterly through theoretical grounding of the Commonwealth itself. It remains largely unknown in Ireland to this day that the genesis of the current iteration of the British Commonwealth of Nations lies actually in Ireland. And the current Commonwealth is, in a sense, the flotsam of the working out of the meaning of 1916. So let's start with what's possible in 1916, and I'm going to cover a little bit of ground that Tom has already covered, so excuse me on that, but I'll do it just so that we're all clear on what I'm talking about. So what are the three major positions that exist in 1916 for the purposes of this talk? So we've got an Irish Republican nationalist position, an Irish constitutional nationalist position, and a British position. And I'm including, for the sake of argument and for the sake of simplicity, the unionist position within that it oversimplifies to a certain extent, but it's not really relevant for the purpose of this talk. On the constitutional nationalist side in 1916, the largest claim is for home rule in an undivided Ireland. From the point of view of Britain, the most that is allowable is home rule for some part of Ireland, but excluding some as yet undefined landmass in the northeast. And from the point of view of the Republican nationalists, the only thing that is acceptable is complete freedom for the United Kingdom. So what do each of these positions mean? The first one, the Republican nationalist position, is relatively simple. It tends not to be clothed in kind of legal rhetoric, but we have a fairly straightforward definition given of it by Pearce, where he talks about Irish freedom. He says, to the Irish mind, for more than 1,000 years, freedom has had but one definition. It has meant not a limited freedom, a freedom conditioned by the interests of another nation, a freedom compatible with the suzerain authority of a foreign parliament, but absolute freedom, the sovereign control of Irish destiny. So a fairly clear statement. So any limitation, any legal limitation that exists in relation to Irish ability to control its own destiny would be a violation of this freedom as he envisages it. And just to point out that this isn't limited to Pearce. So the preamble to the reorganised Sinn Féin states in its preamble that it would deny the right and oppose the will of the British Parliament and British Crown or any other foreign government to legislate for Ireland. The constitutional nationalist position in 1916 is to call for home rule for Ireland. This is not Dominion status, as Thomas pointed out. It's a bit difficult sometimes, I think, to grasp what Dominion status means, but we do have an expression of the view of the constitutional nationalist position of what Dominion status meant to them in 1918. If you look at the proceedings of the Irish Convention, they say Dominion form of constitution rests on three main principles. The Imperial Parliament retains control over all imperial affairs, foreign relations, the making of peace and war, the army and navy. The Dominion Parliament is technically a subordinate one, whose bills must receive the royal assent to become valid and whose acts may legally be overridden by the Imperial Parliament. And subject to these limitations, the Dominion has unfettered power of national self-government, including full control of all taxation. The key, I think, to note in relation to this is that this position, even 1918, is not a full claim for Dominion status. As Tom has pointed out, the claim is formulated a little later, but for example, if you look at the proceedings of the Irish Convention, they are prepared to accept that they will not have control over excise and customs duty at this point in time, at least for a provisional period. So they're not even looking for Dominion status then. It's also clear that in 1916, neither in 1916 nor in 1918 are Britain prepared to accept Dominion status. If you take the response of David Lloyd George to the convention as illustrative of the British position, he says that a settlement can now be reached which will reserve by common consent to the Imperial Parliament its suzerainty, its control of the army, navy and foreign policy and other imperial services, while providing for Irish representation at Westminster and for a proper contribution from Ireland to imperial expenditure. The definition of suzerainty is really complicated at this point in time and really difficult to formulate with any degree of absolute precision. But one thing that is common to all definitions of it is that it involves some form of international subordination on the part of the lesser state to the parent state. So what's clear in 1916 and indeed in 1918 is that the legal claims of the Republican nationalists are sharply divergent from either those of the constitutional nationalists or of the British. And this obviously changes as the War of Independence wears on. And at the cessation of hostilities, Lloyd George is prepared to offer Ireland Dominion status, which he claimed was an opportunity such as never dawned in Irish people's history before. It goes beyond what the Irish Convention scheme was demanding in 1918. So if we take Dominion status as a thing that is worked out by 1921-22, what we should ask ourselves as a first question, I think, is this position consistent with 1916? And if not, in what elements is it not consistent with it? And if we take the definition that I gave earlier in relation to Pearce's idea of freedom as absolute freedom to do what one wills, we can formulate, or at least I can formulate, three questions that we could ask to determine whether or not Ireland is fully free. The first question is, next one. Is it possible, is there any body which claims the ability to legislate with respect to Ireland? And the answer to that is yes. Westminster claims by virtue of its own British Act that it retains the power to legislate in relation to Ireland insofar as that power existed in relation to Canada. The second question we could ask is, are the representatives who negotiate and sign the treaty on the Irish side representatives of an international power? Britain never accords them this appellation. So you see this in a way that is quite interesting, which is that what we refer to here as the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the actual technical title is the Articles of Agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland. And not only that, but actually, if you read the memoirs of those civil servants that worked in the Colonial Office and Dominion's office, even 50 years later, they always refer to it as the agreement, never the treaty. This is a peculiarly Irish position that we refer to it as a treaty. Finally, is it possible that the Free State can leave? Because if you have ultimate legal power, you should have the ability to leave any organisation that you're part of. And again, David Lloyd George says you do not have the power to leave. He bases this in part on the geographical proximity of Ireland to the UK. And he says, off the top of my head, I think he says the geographical proximity presents a position which cannot be denied. Basically, it's strategically important that you remain part of the Commonwealth. You cannot leave. So what's an offer in 1921 and 22 is clearly a new settlement, which goes beyond what is an offer in 1916, but it's also significantly short of the complete independence that's sought by Sinn Féin. So what I want to look at for the remainder of the paper is what occurs between 22 and the Declaration of a Republic in 1949. And we can basically divide that period into two kind of periods again. Okay, so that's not a great definition. So between 22 and 32, when we've come to Gael in government, we can adopt the nomenclature that's been put forward by David Harkness and refer to it as the restless dominion. And between 32 and 48/49, we can call the state the absent dominion. In relation to 22 to 32, I propose to look at Collins's advocacy of the 1921 Articles of Agreement as a starting point, hence the Stepping Stones article, or the title I initially gave. And then the second thing I want to look at is between 32 and 48, I want to look at De Valera's counter-proposals for 1921, which are sometimes referred to as document 2A. Document number 2. So the 1921 settlement is argued for by Michael Collins in perhaps the most famous political statement that exists in Irish political life as, in my opinion, it gives us freedom, not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop to, but the freedom to achieve it. So the question we should ask ourselves is he correct? And the answer to this is, in a very lawyerly answer, yes and no. From a legal point of view, he's wrong. I don't think there can be any doubt about this. There are two primary reasons for this. First of all, the treaty itself is lodged by the government of the Irish Free State with the League of Nations. This makes it a matter of international law, which means that barring a repudiation or renunciation of the treaty, any change in the treaty status must be achieved by means of bilateral negotiations between the United Kingdom and Ireland. Now, that's the Irish point of view. So if Ireland fails to comply with that, it is in breach of its own opinion of what international law demands. And it's interesting to note that between 1922 and 1932, Cumann na Gael act in accordance with this view. They attempt to negotiate bilateral agreements in relation to the abolition of the appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. But they fail. The second limitation that there is from a legal point of view is as a matter of municipal law. We've already heard earlier today about State Ryan and Lennon, but the interesting thing about that is that the position of the Supreme Court of the Irish Free State is that there is a limitation on the power of the Free State to amend the Constitution itself outside of the Articles of Agreement for a treaty. This means that even if it is possible to conclude a bilateral agreement between the United Kingdom and the Irish Free State, which was largely outside their power, it is still possible and still likely, I would say, that could be declared illegal as a matter of municipal law. So there's a double lock, in a sense, on this freedom to achieve freedom idea. So legally speaking, it's not freedom to achieve freedom. Politically speaking, it is. And the issue is profoundly different. And this is in part because of the way the Commonwealth works, which is it tended to overlook legality in favor of political settlement whenever it was possible to do so. Membership of the Commonwealth provides the Irish Free State the means by which to turn a bilateral dispute with the United Kingdom into a multilateral dispute with the other members of the Commonwealth as well. I think, and this is, I think, a point where I disagree to a slight degree with the points that were made earlier today, which is I think sometimes we can overstate the role of the Irish Free State in relation to this. Nicholas Mansura's argument in relation to the Imperial Conference rings true to me today, where he said, at the Imperial Conferences of 1926 and 1930, the Irish Free State's representatives were in the forefront of every move to secure equality, not only of status, but also of function. She strengthened greatly the vociferous tendencies within the Commonwealth, though it is probable that the impact of the Irish Free State on the Commonwealth served for the most part to hasten a development which Canadian and South African opinion would in any event have demanded. So I think really they acted as a catalyst to something that probably would have come eventually, though perhaps not in the precise form that they eventually did. It's interesting when you look at the disputes that the Irish Free State concerns itself with, that when it is engaged in bilateral disputes with the United Kingdom, it tends to lose. So the most, I suppose, obvious examples would be the appeal to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which the Irish Free State wants to get rid of. It doesn't succeed in doing this until De Valera comes in. And again, with the Boundary Commission, they lose. However, when they're acting in concert with the other members of the Commonwealth, they tend to win. And there's a very the kind of the axis on which this turns is South Africa, Canada, and the Irish Free State acting in concert. There's actually a very decent reason for this. And if you read the Batterby papers, what he says is that basically Britain would not give things to Ireland that it would give to Canada and South Africa. So if Canada and South Africa are arguing for something, they're prepared to concede. If Ireland comes up and says the same thing, they're going to say no. So it's no surprise then that the bilateral disputes tend not to work out for Ireland, where multilateral ones do. The Balfour Declaration, the Statute of Westminster, are perhaps the best examples of the Free State acting in kind of a multilateral concert to move towards a more independent status. And it's also important, I think, when we look at these imperial conferences, to consider the areas where they make progress. And they include, inter alia, the political acceptance of the right to secede. It's never legally enshrined in the proceedings of the conferences, but it's accepted by 1930 by all of the major protagonists. The form of international treaties which the king could sign, and the self-denying legislative ordinance, which was the Statute of Westminster. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that what we see through these imperial conferences is progressive realization of what Pierce wanted. So his idea that there would be no legal limitation on what they can do, we see a gradual stripping away of this within the empire itself by acting within the system. Politically speaking, the Free State, therefore, is part of a system which fundamentally realigns the Commonwealth on a co-equal basis. And the title of my paper comes from a memo that's written by John Hearn, the legal advisor to the Department of External Affairs in 1932, when he analyzes the legal basis of the Irish Free State, where he says, or he concludes, the Treaty of 1921 has been successfully been used by us abroad, not only to destroy the legal unity of the British Empire, but to destroy the political, the diplomatic, and the international unity of the British Empire as well. The fact of separate foreign policies, the fact of separate diplomatic representation, and the fact of separate treaty engagements have smashed the whole imperial regime and system, and already the jurists have settled down to the task of recasting the theory upon which that regime and that system rested. Now, I think there's a certain amount of hyperbole here because Hearn is trying to curry favour with a new administration which is skeptical of the civil servants. There's a sense of distrust when they first move in, and this is a memo that's written relatively early, so it will appeal to De Valera's Republican tendencies. But there is, I think, a large grain of truth in this as well. The broad thrust of his argument is correct. Between 1932 and 1948, Ireland, either as a free state or as Ireland, pursues a policy of isolation. The ultimate aim of De Valera had been outlined in 1921, that Ireland would become an external associate of the states of the British Commonwealth. This is what is referred to as document number 2. And I've given, if you can see it, that for purposes of common concern, Ireland shall be associated with the states of the British Commonwealth. After coming into power, the Fianna Fáil government immediately becomes involved in a dispute with the United Kingdom over the oath and the non-payment of land tariffs. As a result, with the exception of the economic conference that's held in Ottawa in 1932, the Free State is basically absent from Commonwealth conferences in the 1930s. However, the Commonwealth still continued to treat the Irish Free State as a full member, albeit one that's fairly truculent. And what we see, and I know I'm perhaps moving into territory that's going to be covered in more detail later, we see a kind of a successive stripping away of the crown from the internal machinery of the Free State. It culminates in the complete elimination of the crown from the internal machinery of the state in 1936, following the abdication crisis. And in the course of this, what is passed is the 1936 Executive Authority External Relations Act, which declares that the king is recognized, the Irish Free State recognizes the king so long as it's associated with the Commonwealth, and that the king is recognized by the other Commonwealth members as the symbol of their cooperation. As you can see, there's a very strong similarity between De Valera's idea in 1921 and what he eventually enacts in legislation in 1936. Notwithstanding this change, the Commonwealth still treats the Irish Free State as a member of the Commonwealth, and that basically this has achieved no fundamental change in status. So when 1937 rolls around, they basically say the same as before. The External Relations Act is still in operation. It's still the same system. And the 1937 Constitution simply allows for the machinery to continue. The divergence in approach, however, between the Commonwealth and Ireland and how they view themselves sometimes leads to fairly farcical results. In 1948, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Ireland is invited to a Commonwealth conference to be held in London, and Sean McBride says, where we've been invited, we're not members and we haven't been for years, and Britain says, you just haven't been turning up. So there's a fundamental difference between how the two view each other. What's perhaps underappreciated in Ireland, though, is the importance of the 1936 Act in what happens in the Commonwealth afterwards. Because the 1936 Act actually ends up forming the model for what the Commonwealth is now. It does this not because of any particular importance associated with Ireland, it does it instead because of India. And the difficulty that Britain has in the aftermath of the Second World War is the threat of secession by the members of the Commonwealth. Burma leaves. Britain doesn't really have any strategy to prevent them from leaving. And it becomes clear through the debates in the Constituent Assembly in India that India intends to declare a republic. And the question is, how can one keep India within the Commonwealth? The British government are determined not to lose India in a similar fashion to the way that they lost Burma. So you're going to have to modify the existing grounds of Commonwealth relationship. And what you find is in 1947, in an address to Chatham House, Nicholas Mansura, he's perhaps most famous now as Martin Mansura's father, but actually he was a very prominent theorist of Commonwealth relations at the time. He specifically advocates the use of De Valera's idea of external association as the new model for the Commonwealth. And this has been traced through the briefing documents that exist in the British National Archives to the formulation that is eventually agreed upon for the Commonwealth in 1949. So if you look at it, the phraseology chimes with what happens in 1936. They owe a common allegiance to the Crown, which is the symbol of their free association. So there's basically two tiers of membership, one side of which include the Crown to which they owe allegiance, and then a second, essentially, associate membership, which is what De Valera is advocating in 21. And India is accepted because it accepts the king as the symbol of the free association of its independent member nations, and as such the head of the Commonwealth, which is basically the formula that is existing in the 1936 Act. So, to return to the question posed at the beginning of the talk, was the vision of 1916 influential in the development of the empire? The answer, I think, is unequivocally yes, though I think also it's fair to say not in a way that Pearse or his compatriots would ever have foreseen. Instead, it was the working out of dominion status and that settlement rather than Pearse's idea of freedom, although there is an overlap there, which transformed the empire. It's achieved first through a transformation of the internal workings of the Commonwealth under Cumann na Gael. It's achieved in the second instance by the adoption of De Valera's idea of external association in the Commonwealth. I think it's interesting because this is so often overlooked in Irish history, and this is really because of its proximity to the Declaration of a Republic. So, round about 3 weeks after Ireland declares itself a republic and leaves, it wins. So the position it's been pushing with zero success for 20 years finally prevails 3 weeks after it left. So I think it's in a sense ironic that at the moment of greatest triumph, Ireland decided to vacate the field. Thank you.